Imagine a decision today that alters the lives of people not yet born. The moral weight of that decision feels heavier as you picture countless unknown faces. Millions of tiny possibilities hinge on choices made by people living right now. In this video, we will trace ethical frameworks that try to answer this problem. We will move from philosophical puzzles to political realities and personal choices. By the end, you should feel both intellectually clearer and morally compelled to act differently. The climate crisis is not only environmental but fundamentally moral in nature. Every ton of greenhouse gas emitted today translates into changed weather patterns decades from now. Those changes will shape the lives of people who do not yet exist and cannot vote for us. Intergenerational justice asks how obligations extend across time in a world of irreversible change. Philosophers ask whether current generations owe duties to future people in the same way they owe duties to their children. That question forces us to define what counts as harm and what counts as a life worth living. Different moral theories give different answers about those duties and their scope. Utilitarian frameworks weigh aggregate well-being across generations when calculating the right action for the future. Deontological perspectives insist on rights, duties, and fairness that might not reduce easily to sums of pleasure or pain. The non-identity problem is a philosophical puzzle that disrupts straightforward thinking about future harm. It points out that some actions change who will exist in the future, meaning a person cannot claim they were made worse off by being born under different conditions. That thought can feel unsettling because it seems to absolve many acts that we intuitively regard as wrong. If policies today change which future people will exist tomorrow, then rights and harms become difficult to assign. The non-identity problem says many policies cannot be criticized using a simple person affecting harm argument. Yet this does not mean that anything goes, because there are other moral considerations beyond direct person affecting harms. Person affecting views focus on harms to particular individuals and try to ground obligations there. Impersonal views evaluate outcomes across states of the world rather than specific people. When applied to climate ethics, these positions lead to profoundly different prescriptions for action and responsibility. Discounting the future is a practical tool in economics that raises moral questions in philosophy. When future harms are discounted, they appear less urgent, reducing incentives to bear costs today for distant benefits. Ethical debates ask whether discount rates properly respect the equal worth of future people versus the legitimate needs of present people. What should a single person do when the problem is collective and complex in nature? The ethical debate between individual and collective responsibility matters for both conduct and public policy. Some philosophers argue that systemic problems require systemic solutions rather than moralizing individual guilt. Collective responsibility falls on institutions, governments, and corporations that shape emissions and infrastructure. Democracies and international institutions have unique moral obligations to craft policies protecting future people. The design of institutions, therefore, becomes a central ethical concern as well as a political one. Governments can implement policies that distribute costs and benefits fairly across generations. Carbon pricing, regulation, and public investment in resilience are political tools with moral implications. The choices made now determine whether future societies inherit burdened infrastructure or resilient systems that protect well-being. Ethics of consumption asks whether lifestyle changes are morally required for future people. Reducing personal emissions can be both a symbolic act and a practical contribution to larger societal change. Yet, moral worth cannot rest entirely on individual sacrifice, when structural barriers and global inequalities severely constrain options. Guilt can motivate action, but moral guilt should not be the only lever for change in societies. Practical impact and the ability to influence political systems often determine what is most effective ethically. We must therefore balance personal integrity with strategic collective action that amplifies individual choices into broader reforms. Climate justice exposes deep global inequalities that complicate simple moral prescriptions. Wealthier nations have historically contributed the most emissions, while poorer nations suffer the worst impacts already. Any ethical assessment must therefore account for historical responsibility, capacity, and need when assigning duties to act. Historical emissions create moral debts that are difficult to quantify yet impossible to ignore. People living in countries that industrialized early benefited enormously from fossil fuel-driven growth. Those benefits translate into greater ability to finance clean transitions today, which creates stronger obligations for those who can pay more. The ethics of rich countries fighting for faster decarbonization involves fairness and solidarity across borders. Developed nations owe assistance and technology transfer to developing nations facing climate harms right now. Justice requires that mitigation and adaptation not simply be abstract goals, but embodied commitments to compensate and support those harmed. The precautionary principle says that uncertainty should not be an excuse for inaction when risks are potentially catastrophic. It places moral weight on preventing serious, irreversible harms, even if probabilities are contested. In the climate context, this principle shifts the burden toward cautious stewardship and protective policies. Risk and uncertainty complicate, but do not eliminate moral reasons to act decisively and fairly. We cannot know every possible outcome, yet moral responsibility demands prudence in the face of plausible catastrophe. Acting on precaution means investing in resilience, reducing emissions, and protecting vulnerable communities. Now, new technologies like carbon removal or geoengineering introduce ethical dilemmas about control and long-term consequences. They tempt societies with promises of technical fixes while raising questions about consent for future people. Evaluating those technologies ethically requires humility, international governance, and rigorous assessment of risks versus benefits. Intergenerational solidarity can be built through institutions that lock in fair policies over time. Constitutional commitments, independent central banks, and long-term trusts can translate moral obligations into durable action. Politics must therefore cultivate norms that protect future interests against short-term opportunism. Economic instruments such as carbon taxes and green bonds can finance fair transitions when designed with distributional justice in mind. They can shift costs toward polluters and fund adaptation for those most affected. Ethical design insists that such instruments be progressive, transparent, and tied to real emission reductions rather than symbolic gestures. When we ask what we owe future generations, the answer is not only survival but flourishing for them as moral patients. We owe them stable ecosystems, fair institutions, and access to opportunities that allow lives worth living. That claim pushes us to think about positive duties as well as negative ones. Applying moral frameworks to concrete policies clarifies trade-offs and priorities that citizens should demand. Ethics can guide design of social safety nets, progressive taxation, and international climate finance. When morality is woven into policy design, it becomes less about guilt and more about structural fairness and effectiveness. Psychological barriers make it difficult to imagine unknown future people as subjects of moral concern. Our minds evolved to prioritize present and proximate threats rather than diffuse long-term risks. Art, education, and storytelling can expand moral imagination to include the distant future and motivate collective action. Philosophically speaking, future people are moral patients whose claims deserve equal moral consideration. That perspective reframes emissions as violations of duties rather than merely neutral policy questions. Recognizing their moral status challenges us to treat future lives with the same seriousness we afford present lives. In the end, climate ethics demands both humility and boldness from those living today. Humility to accept the limits of knowledge and deep uncertainty about the future. Boldness to design institutions and practices that protect unknown people and expand opportunity for all who will inherit the world. If this discussion has given you a new way to see moral obligations across time, then the real work begins with action. Lobby for fair policy, support institutions that protect the long term, and make personal choices that align with collective goals. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe for more deep dives into ideas that shape our future.